Before we dive in, here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Hey, movie lovers, I'm Pete Wright.
And I'm Andy Nelson. We are the hosts of the Next Reel Film Podcast.
If you're passionate about films like we are, you'll love our show. Each week, we dive deep into a movie, discussing everything from the story and performances to the cinematography and score.
Not to mention budgets and awards. We have covered iconic series like Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather trilogy, examining themes of power, family, and the dark side of the American dream.
We've explored the works of groundbreaking directors like Catherine Bigelow, discussing her mastery of tension.
We've looked at heist films, great car chases, great years in film, couples on the run, and more.
Our discussions go beyond the surface, examining what makes each film tick. We believe that when the movie ends, the conversation begins.
And we'd love for you to join that conversation. Find the Next Reel Film Podcast on your favorite podcast app or at thenextreel.com.
The Next Reel. When the movie ends,
our conversation begins. Welcome to CinemaScope, where we venture into the chilling depths of cinema's genre landscapes. I'm Andy Nelson, your guide on this journey to bridge film genres, subgenres, and movements, ultimately deepening our understanding of them all. Today we're immersing ourselves in the icy, brooding world of Nordic Noir. Prepare to be captivated by the genre's bleak landscapes, complex characters, and haunting investigations as we uncover the secrets that lurk beneath the surface of Scandinavian society. Join us as we explore the key themes, motifs, and the profound impact of Nordic Noir on the global crime fiction scene. Joining me today, I have Professor of Scandinavian and Comparative Literature, Jakob Stougaard-Nielsen. Jakob, welcome to the show.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you. This is going to be a great conversation about a lot of really interesting stories. So let's just start getting a sense as to your background. What initially drew you to kind of study Scandinavian literature and specifically Nordic Noir, and how did it kind of lead you to kind of become an expert in this subject?
Yeah, it's not a very gruesome story. I'm afraid to disappoint your listeners. and as you said, I come from literature and something as far away from crime fiction as Henry James studies. So it couldn't be further afield. But when I came to London to take up my job here at University College London, now back in 2007, as a lecturer then in Scandinavian literature, I was amazed a few years later by going to the underground in London and seeing people, everybody were reading Stieg Larsson, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I mean, coming from Scandinavian literature, that's not something you're used to doing. I mean, you're not used to seeing people reading Scandinavian literature everywhere. Yeah. So it was a bit of a surprise to see this. And slowly thereafter, journalists started calling me, trying to explain how can it be that these, wonderfully happy, egalitarian, orderly welfare states in Scandinavia, they're producing so much crime. We saw the Wallander series coming out on TV. We had The Killing, all these, the crime wave that started in Scandinavia around 2009, in translation at least. And so I started to think, well, I better find out what this is all about. And I wanted to find out, what is it that people know about Scandinavia? What is it they learn about Scandinavia through watching all these crime shows? And that's when we decided in my department, Scandinavian Studies, to set up a book club. We called it the Nordic Noir Book Club. We thought that might catch on in 2010. And the idea here was really to engage with readers, with viewers, and try to understand what was it that they got from engaging with these, incredible stories and crime stories about Scandinavia, and what kind of preconceptions did they have. And that took me to a really wonderful documentary on Nordic Noir, the story of Scandinavian crime fiction that came out on BBC. So I really started sort of by accident to immerse myself in the world of Scandinavian crime, coming from a completely different area. And that's where I still am, 15 years later, still answering questions about, what is going on. And it has mostly been about literature. It's been about television series a lot here in the UK. And so I'm really thrilled about the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners about all the crime films that have come up, because there are some crossovers, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating subgenre in the world of kind of crime stories because it is so specifically set in one part of the world. I guess we should probably just start. Let's kind of get a definition as to like what Nordic noir is. I mean, I've also heard Scandinavian noir, and it's like I know that there's kind of that defining part of the world: Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iceland. Greenland, I guess, is kind of included in that whole section.
And the Faroe Islands, yes,
and the Faroe Islands. Okay, sure.
Region.
Yeah, right. So, what is Nordic noir?
That's a great question. And after 15 years, I'm not sure I'm anywhere closer. I'm like one of those detectives who will really never find out who the murderer was in the end. So I think that's part of the deal. And thinking about it as a genre is interesting as well, because if it is a genre, it's a genre that is using and reflecting, appropriating lots of established genres in crime fiction, both in literature and in film and television, coming from many other places, notably American hard-boiled crime, whodunits in Britain. And can we really talk about a genre just because these genre films, these genre novels have been written or are set in a particular region, which we call the Nordic region or Scandinavia? That's an interesting question. And there are some traits that people have then been lashing on to, saying that this is what defines Nordic noir. And some of the things that we have often heard going right back to the beginning of when people started using Nordic noir as a concept, as a phenomenon, was that, of course, there has to be in Scandinavian languages, of which, as you just mentioned, there's quite a lot of them. In the beginning, it was mostly Swedish, Danish, Norwegian that people thought of as belonging to this genre. The setting had to be recognizably Scandinavian, and we can get to later when we talk about the films what that might mean, what constitutes a Nordic landscape. But that was something that people really thought about. That is associated with a kind of mood as well. So a melancholic mood. It's all sort of in grayish tones. It is dark, and that's why people have associated probably with the sort of a film noir set, especially in the TV side of things. We have very dark cityscapes, gloomy. It's always raining, right? That's one of the characteristics of the genre.
Raining or snowing. Yeah.
It's raining or snowing. And then we have these detectives that are always like disgruntled, morose. You can see a lot is going on inside, maybe not so much action on the outside. We can talk about that later, but there's a lot of sort of psychological stuff going on with our detectives. And strong female leads was also something that people have mentioned. And finally, it was particularly outside of Scandinavia, it came associated with quality TV. A lot of these American television shows, The Wire, Sopranos, that were going on at the time, and the Scandinavian shows, no matter what kind of stories there were associated with sort of a highbrow quality TV, something that you could be allowed to watch TV even if you were an intellectual or if you were a highbrow consumer. And of course, it wasn't at all produced for that particular segment in Scandinavia. This was family entertainment, if you would have it, or it was like primetime television. And when it traveled abroad, it became associated with sort of a high quality television.
Gotcha. Now, part of the name noir, I mean, film noir obviously is a very prominent genre in American cinema. But just to clarify, like, just because it has noir in the title, we're not saying that, like, it feels very different from film noir. There's not like femme fatales or you're following a protagonist who falls for something or makes a bad decision and ends up going the wrong way in life. Like, this is totally different. It's just noir. It's just kind of the darkness. It just kind of gives a sense for the mood, I guess, right?
I think so. And some people also associate it with a brand more than a genre, where sort of everything that came out of Scandinavia, no matter what genre it was in, whether it was crime or thrillers or drama or historical drama, it all became lumped into the same package of Nordic noir simply because it was Nordic and because it was associated with, a bit of sort of psychological interest, maybe social criticism was also some of the things that people have been thinking about. The noir part I guess in some of the early films, you see some aspects of neo-noir, maybe more that could be associated with the 1970s, 1980s, but definitely a step further away from film noir is the way it's understood.
Right. Now, you've kind of talked a little bit about this. There is kind of this global impact that it's had as far as like, especially these TV shows and the books and everything. And, a lot of these TV shows that started as Scandinavian shows have been remade, like The Killing is a perfect example. Like we've had the American remake of that as well. So, I just think there's something important about Nordic Noir as far as this global reach that it has been having the last several decades. And that seems to be kind of an important part that, I don't know, did it surprise people, or is it something that has kind of created more recognition for it?
Yeah, I think it was a massive surprise, especially for the television production companies. We have to remember that, especially the Danish television dramas that were produced sort of in the 2007 and the next decade, that they were produced for a national audience, and they were produced with that audience in mind. So they are very local stories. Some of them are even dealing with everyday politics in Scandinavia. A show like Borgen, which is a political drama that became a very famous show after The Killing, is certainly very, very local. So it was a surprise that these local shows seem to travel so well. They were also very different in the way that they narrated that story. So let's see, the first season of The Killing was 20 episodes with one murder. I mean, who could have imagined that a story like that would grip the attention of people everywhere? And then The Bridge is another example, which very much is about, a Danish cop and a Swedish cop and all this sort of small disagreements and differences of national ideas and languages and stuff. How could that be interesting to others? And there's been remakes of The Bridge. I think last time I counted, there were 7 or 8 different remakes set in different sort of border regions around the world. So it's been quite, and it's very difficult today to think back to a time when there was no Nordic television internationally, right? Where if you were watching a Nordic film, you were a film aficionado going to some art house cinema. These were not things that you would have access to. And I think just developing this list of films we were watching today, that would have been impossible before streaming, before the kind of technologies we have today, and also before television formats were internationalized the way they were. And I think Nordic Noir or Scandinavian crime had a big role to play also in the shaping of that audience. I mean, one of the first shows that were produced by Netflix was Lilyhammer, which has the
first
American
one, right? Yeah.
Exactly, the first one, set in Norway with an American mafia person sort of living anonymously in Norway, and the kind of tensions between those. So I think, yes, it's a huge surprise and something that has been played with ever since. And to me, Nordic Noir is really only Nordic Noir in this perception of the border crossing aspect of it. That it's really only Nordic Noir when it translates into a sort of globalized or at least a transnational media landscape. Because, I mean, in Scandinavia, they're quite happy to talk about Danish crime fiction, just crime fiction, right? Or Swedish crime fiction. They see all the differences between the national genres or the national ways of representing their own nations and the kind of things that they do. But as soon as it travels outside, it becomes a regional thing. And outside, you can see all the coherence between the different national styles or the different narratives. So yes, I agree. Nordic Noir is really a global phenomenon. It's an international phenomenon, also in the way that we perceive the genre as sort of a whole.
Well, let's take a step back and talk about where it came from, because like I hadn't heard of Nordic Noir before. Like sometime in the last 10 years, it kind of was something that became an earworm, probably with the popularity of the Dragon Tattoo with the Millennium Trilogy. But I mean, it started in literary origins, is my understanding, and kind of like that's where it grew from. And obviously, there had been crime stories. I mean, one of the films we'll talk about in our member bonus segment is a film from the 70s, and so I mean, there's obviously crime stories out there. So at what point, like, what's the shift? How did it get to this place where we have Nordic Noir?
Well, the term started in 2010.
Okay.
So it's a fairly new phenomenon thinking about Nordic noir as a term that covers multiple narratives that seems to have something in common apart from them just being crime stories. But of course, as you say, there's been crime stories going back to even before Edgar Allan Poe in the Nordic countries. There was a massive success with Sjöwall and Wahlöö in the 1960s, 1970s. And this was the period, I think, one could say that Scandinavian crime fiction becomes its own. And in that case, Swedish crime fiction with Sjöwall and Wahlöö starts becoming a literary field that sort of relies on its own stories. Previously, a lot of Scandinavian crime fiction published would be recognizable, if not adaptations, then at least very similar to the whodunit tradition, the clue puzzle, maybe sort of ironic takes on the hard-boiled genre, because it's very difficult to make San Francisco and Los Angeles in Scandinavia. But a lot of the crime fiction up until the 1960s and 70s was always, imported or sort of Scandinavian versions, recognizable versions of other traditions. But with Sjöwall and Wahlöö, you get sort of a sense that we have a particular kind of Scandinavian take on the crime genre, and in that case, the police procedural. And of course, they didn't grab it out of the blue air. They took it from Ed McBain in some ways, but they really started thinking about how can we use the crime genre to talk about current political issues or current social issues, ethical issues that matters to people in this location in Sweden at the time. And then you will find something similar around the same time in Norway. You have Gunnar Staalesen, who starts writing sort of Norwegian hard-boiled crime series. You have neorealists in Denmark writing psychological thrillers that are also very much investigating what has happened to these Nordic states in the sort of post-welfare state, if we might say that, in this sort of in an age of crisis, in an age of redefinition of what it means to live in these sort of small nation states to the far north that is becoming part of a much wider globalized, maybe some would say neo-capitalist society, consumer society, and what have you. So that is when I would say Nordic noir as genre, as a style, starts to develop without it being called Nordic noir. Of course, this is just Swedish crime writing, Danish crime writing, and so on and so forth. But with Sjöwall and Wahlöö, we start having that, and it's also the time where they start having international impact.
And that's because they're the authors of the Martin Beck series of detective thrillers, and is it when they start kind of with that umbrella of the Martin Beck novels that suddenly that is what causes that international reach?
Yeah, I mean, they're not called the Martin Beck novels by them. They have a subtitle for it called Novel of a Crime. So they conceive these 10 crime novels as their they call it a scalpel, that they take apart the welfare state, the social democratic welfare state of the time. They are, of course, police procedurals as we would come to know them, but they're also full of social criticism of, characters who are having issues with this and that. I mean, this welfare state in Sweden that they're describing is a dystopian welfare state, which, of course, didn't really, it's not realism, of course, at the time, but they saw there were some aspects of the welfare state that left some people behind, and they were trying to investigate what happens to people living in this particular kind of a welfare regime, or in this kind of society where everything is modernizing, everything is centralizing, and we have this growing state. What happens to all the old things? What happens to the police?
Yeah, who gets left behind?
Exactly.
Right.
And it was also a time where you have a lot of these novels. You have Vietnam War demonstrations. You have issues around modernization of the urban environment. You have the reflection of the Million Homes program that we had in Sweden at the time, where the social welfare state starts to building all these new cities, where they moved all the workers out, after the sort of the deterioration of the city centers. So you have a lot of processes, social processes that are really changing society And these crime novels were used to try and understand what is happening and also sort of poke a knife into sort of the self-confidence, I think, of this sort of highly modernized welfare state.
I mean, and each of the countries had their own version of that, essentially, right? Like they all have their own governments. They all, the people are have their own sets of beliefs and everything. But within that, because of just the changes in the world and everything else, they all are still dealing with some of these issues of the changes with the welfare state of different elements that are part of kind of these social and political issues that they're all examining through these stories.
Yeah, I think so. They don't all have their own Sjøva and Valor. As I said, in Norway,
Yeah, right.
I think the Gunnar Staalesen Hardboiled Crime is a really good reflection on the kind of oil boom that is happening. And he has one of his novels is set in Stavanger, which is the oil capital of Norway. So you have a literature that deals with those kinds of changes to a nation that saw itself as a kind of a backwater and becomes this sort of major player in sort of with capital and influx of all sorts of things from the great globalizing world. And in Denmark, you have a much more, I would say it's sort of turning inside to investigate the psychological ramifications of a new set of values that are coming in. And we find that in some of the crime novels written in the 60s and 70s in Denmark, which are psychological thrillers, I would say. And they also became international films in their own right. And we see the first international adaptations of Scandinavian crime fiction already in the 70s, which is something that might surprise people, apart from The Laughing Policeman with Walter Matthau in the leading role, where Stockholm has become San Francisco
A little different,
in the early 70s.
little warmer,
Little different. Then you also have a Canadian production of one of the Danish novels. You have the beginning of a tradition in German films taking on the Beck novels as well. So already in the 70s, we start to see this internationalization of the Scandinavian crime novel, which is because the genre itself, the crime genre itself, is an international genre to begin with. So it's something that, can easily be adopted. And they were very successful in Europe, these crime novels already in the 60s and 70s.
And that's really interesting that at that point, we're already starting to see these adaptations and the genre already having a little bit of an international reach. And it hasn't quite become that point where it's Nordic Noir yet, but it definitely is feeling like it's on the way. We're at that point where it's a precursor. So from that point in the 70s to really, I don't know, when would you say kind of the first films we're really talking about? We'll talk about one from the 70s in our member bonus, but otherwise it's really kind of the 90s. Is it about that point when there is this influx of popularity with both the writing and the adaptations?
Yeah, I think it's really the writing here in the 90s that sets the stage, and film adaptations of those stories. And one we will also talk about later is Miss Miller's Sense of Snow, Peter Høeg, which is in the early 90s. At almost the same time, we have Henning Mankell, who is publishing his first novels in the Wallander series, 91, I think it is, with Faceless Killers, and you have other of the major crime writers coming out in the early 90s, and we are also starting to see sort of a collaboration between literature and then the film dimension to them. And Henning Mankell is quite an interesting author, because not only did he find out how to best sell his own writing in an international market through the use of agents and so on, place them in particular places and getting good translations. But he also took control of the film rights of his works through establishing the film company Yellowbird that has produced a lot of the films that is coming up.
Yeah, I saw its logo a lot when I was watching all these films.
Exactly. And so that was a very conscious strategy that he used. He also established his own publishing house, Leopard Forlaget, to take control of his own content. And admirably, he funded a lot of the revenues from the selling of his content into the translation and publishing of mostly African literature, because he spent a great deal of his time in Africa as a theater director as well. So it came out in sort of a socially conscious and sort of global awareness idea for him that he wanted to further this aspect of literature as well in Sweden.
I think that from the start, and I definitely see this as we start watching these films from the 90s. And, I think the first book I actually read of any of these was actually Miss Smilla's Sense of Snow. It actually wasn't Miss Smilla's Sense of Snow, but whatever it was a different
Feeling
something.
For Snow.
Feeling for Snow. Yeah, I knew the title was something. Miss Smilla's Feeling for Snow. I read that in the 90s because, that was just one of those things that was on at the bookstore, like, popular now. And I was like, I wonder what that's all about. And it was a thrilling book. It was really interesting. And it kind of threw me into this world of really enjoying a lot of these stories and the films. But I also think that there's an interesting element to society that we're seeing. It's been growing quite a bit now with the fascination for crime stories in general. And I think you see it with network television as like Discovery started pushing like investigation discovery and all these crime shows, like true crime sorts of things. And then in the world of podcasts, true crime is still generally like the most popular genre of podcasts that's out there. Like people love crime stories. And I think there's something that taps into the darkness of these stories and then just also the complexity of the characters that is a draw for people as they start enjoying this and kind of exploring these stories.
Yeah, and I think the authors of the early 90s, they understood this because they were probably not, just like me, they probably didn't come from a long tradition of having lived on crime fiction and wanted to immediately go into crime fiction. Authors like Henning Mankell was writing other kinds of literature. Mai Sjöwall and Per Wahlöö were also interested in doing other things, but they immediately saw that, okay, we can write about, what is wrong in society. We can talk about these complex issues around families, about psychology, and about the kind of things that occupies people. But in order to get readers, we need to find the form. We need to use a form that people will consume. And through that, we can then deliver the kind of stories that we want. And I think that is one of the red threads that go through sort of the whole crime tradition in Scandinavia from the 90s, from Sjöwall and Wahlöö and all the way up to the Danish television series, that there is sort of this idea of providing a narrative that people will find exciting, that will capture people. But at the same time, there has to be sort of an ethical or moral or political or social story underneath of that. And that actually became one of the dogmas of the Danish radio drama division that they had. They call it double storytelling. That on the one hand, you have the exciting story, but you also have to have something for that investigates society in a way, because it's a television station that produces drama for the whole population and is funded by the population through.
Well, it makes sense because thinking about these films, and I guess let's just kind of expand on what we were talking about as far as like their key themes and characteristics. But really, like oftentimes, it paints society as like everything is kind of fine in society, but there is this dark underbelly that they really start exploring. There is this moral ambiguity that we start getting a sense of. We start seeing some racism and misogyny and flaws within the welfare state and delving deep into the dark underbelly of what can happen within a family, even like, how people treat each other, or socioeconomic status in some of the cases, where what the rich can do, or, things like that. And I think that's what I really start seeing with these films, is that there's so much more than just a detective story of a police investigating a crime. It really starts digging into more of these themes that I think give people a sense of a darker sense of society that, and I guess there's always that human draw to watching the darkness. And it's why people love horror movies too. It's like you want to touch into the darkness so that you can feel more alive, so that you feel okay in your own world and everything. And by looking at the dark things that people do in some of these stories, you can get a sense of the world, but also you feel safer perhaps in your own,
Yeah, it's almost like the crimes are investigating the detectives in many of these, in these theories. So the crime plots become a mirror image of the detectives investigating themselves, their own feelings, not for snow, but feelings for society, feelings for their family, their place in life. It is not, and that's where when you think about crime stories as critiques of the welfare state, that's not quite what I think is going on. The welfare states in Scandinavia was put in place to try and combat all these sort of inequalities, to make a harmonious. So there was a utopian idea in many ways, called the people's home in Swedish, and this idea, of course, can only work so far, because we are still humans. People are complex. People have emotions. They have aspirations. They have, dark thoughts, and dark things happen in everywhere. So I think the crime novels are trying to investigate, what is it that's happening to me, to my family, to my society around me, despite the fact that everything should be great.
Yeah, exactly.
That is what is happening here. And I think Mankell is a really good example of this again in his Faceless Killers, which was his first crime novel. He came back from being abroad, and he started seeing in the Swedish society there was all these tensions between refugees coming in and a growing sense of racism in a state that had prided itself with being sort of globalist, by being cosmopolitan, caring, and what have you. And he started out trying to investigate that, not by trying to, I guess, merely representing sort of right-wing radicals or, extremists, but by putting a whole human being in the detective, in the middle of this, with all of his sort of conflicting emotions, nostalgias, melancholic understanding of what is happening to society. Things have gotten away from him, and he is trying to sort this out. And that's where many of these detectives, I think, in the tradition, they are placed as sort of, they refract or they reflect the kind of tensions in society, and they're trying to work that through as much as they're trying to solve a crime.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of that personal growth, which I suppose in Hollywood script parlance is part of the, you want to have your character arc, but you want to have your story. And I suppose that's just part of the nature of any, as Hollywood say, any good script. But at the same time, I can't help but feel like there's just such a strong thematic sense of development for these characters, and you really kind of get this sense of brooding that they have, particularly some of the ones that we'll be talking about. Let's talk about the visuals a little bit and kind of get a sense of like establishing what this subgenre feels like in style, cinematography, everything to kind of contribute to this atmosphere. I mean, we were already talking about how there's often rain and snow, but what else really makes these films stand out?
Well, I think the films are very different when we start having a look at how they are set up visually, how they're using light, how they're using shadows, how they're using different kinds of shots. Rewatching all these films again, one thing that becomes quite apparent is that they like to put people standing on beaches looking out at the sea, which is always changing colors. So this kind of space between the solidity of the land and the sort of waves that are constantly moving, and the detectives contemplating the kind of natural environment as reflections of their own psyche. And I think that's how they use, apart from that, that's how landscape and lighting and colors are being used as representations of the psychological state of our characters. We get lots of aerial shots of landscapes, whether it's in Greenland, whether it's in northern Sweden, northern Norway. The landscapes becomes almost like characters in the film, and that is done through camera movement. They lead us into a story, but they also lead us back to a story again, using often different kinds of color palettes. It's quite clear that a lot of the films from the 90s are quite dark in it, the dark tones, if not gray. It's always November in in Scandinavian films, or something to that extent.
Or it feels that way. Even in the first film we're talking about, Insomnia, it's Norwegian summer, but it sure still feels like it's November.
It feels very misty. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so I also feel that in some of these films there is a lot of work with characters' expressions and faces. Use of close-up is something that is quite apparent. So maybe less focus on action and more focus on establishing characters through their expression, lots of work with characters, I think. And I think that comes out of a cinematic tradition in Scandinavia and working with actors in particular ways. There is, in particular in the television industry in Denmark, there was at the outset when in the late 90s, early 2000s, they started to really think about how to produce a drama television in a Danish way. Of course, they went to the set of NYPD Blue, the Fox Studios, to try and learn how to do production of high quality TV drama. And they focused on the kind of the vision of the script writer, but they were also working really closely with a film school, which is located almost next to the new Danish radio in Copenhagen. And this film school, of course, has produced some of the best cinematographers. There's some of the best directors. We have Winterberg, we have Lars von Trier, we have all these sort of filmmakers, and the younger filmmakers who are coming out of that school. They have been many of them have been sort of through the Danish radio drama division as well. So there is that auteur-driven, almost, or screenwriter-driven one vision going on in the drama presentation. So I think that's part of the quality, I think, of the way that even the television series they work is in this very filmic mode, because there is that interaction. Denmark is a small country, so I mean, if you want to get something done, there's not that many opportunities. But so there is that close relationship. But that was actually something that was encouraged, and there was worked on to that extent.
Interesting. I guess one other question that I have just before we start jumping into the films themselves, other than like obviously the Nordic environment and everything like that, is there anything that you would say as far as like the way that these films are like paced or the story unfolds that actually makes them feel different from like a crime thriller from America or Britain or somewhere else?
Well, I think first of all, I think they are slower in their character development in some of these examples. I'm thinking, of course, of television series, but also in some of the films, unless they are very obviously referring to a sort of Hollywood studio. I mean, one of the films, like Headhunters, is very clearly using some of the sort of visual language of a Western or an American crime thriller. So they are certainly learned to make internationally looking, high quality, high production value films and television series from elsewhere. But I do think that the narratives are slower. They are much more interested in character development. They're exploring their detectives more than they are interested in the action sequences. The killing is one good example of that, where you have 20 episodes in one murder. I mean, not many people would last that long. But that is really just not only to investigate the development of the detective, but also looking at the family around who have lost their child in a horrific murder.
Yeah, right.
So they're really exploring all these issues such as guilt. They're exploring issues around empathy, how the detectives, they translate what they're witnessing in the wider world and the crimes in their own family situation. So they are crime films, but as you also said earlier, they are so much more than crime films. They are merging a lot of different kinds of genres. They are hybrid, and some of them are very consciously hybrid, such as Stieg Larsson crime novels. They are using all the different tropes and genre traits of a lot of different kinds of crime thrillers. So I have the feeling that they're also very keen at borrowing different kinds of genre traits from wherever they think it might work, and therefore using lots of different traditions.
Gotcha. It is fascinating to see how these stories are constructed and unfold. Well, we're going to talk about 5 films during the main show, and then we're actually going to do 6 films for the member bonus. So I'm going to run down the list real quick. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back. So the films we're going to discuss are Eric, and you're going to probably correct me on all these names when we get to them, but Eric Skjoldbjerg's Insomnia. That's a tough one. Baltasar Kormaker's Jar City, Niels Arden Oplev's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Morten Tildum's Headhunters, and Gustav Møller's The Guilty. And then for our member bonus section, we'll discuss Bo Widerberg's The Man on the Roof, Kjell Sundvall's The Hunters, Billy August's Smilla's Sense of Snow, Daniel Lind Lagerlof's The Pyramid, which is one of the Wallander TV movies, Mikkel Norgard's Department Q, The Keeper of Lost Causes, and we'll end with Thomas Alfredson's The Snowman. So we'll be right back, and we'll jump into the films. Here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Oh, there you are. I was hoping I'd cross paths with you today. I'd like to invite you to visit the Story Well. It's a place where storytellers of all stripes gather. From improv performers to authors, screenwriters to playwrights, we all tell stories. But we're not here to talk about craft. We're here to make something out of nothing. Each episode of the podcast, your host, that's me, sits down with a creative person, and based on a series of random prompts, we get elements that we make into a story. Will it be a noir novel about King Kong? Or a Broadway musical about JFK? Even we don't know. That's the fun part. But what do you get out of this, besides a good time with fun people? Simple. The idea is then yours. That's right. Whatever we come up with, we give it away for anyone to use however they'd like, no strings attached. It's like each episode comes with a free prize inside. The Story Well with Kyle Olson. We'll save you a seat at the table.
Let's start tackling each of these movies. We're touching on films from, I think we're covering the gamut as far as all the different countries. We're going to start with Insomnia. This is 1997. Eric Skjoldbjerg, is that how you say it?
Yeah, I guess so. Skjoldbjerg, yeah.
Skjoldbjerg, okay. Insomnia from 1997. This is, it has been remade. A lot of people might be familiar with the Christopher Nolan remake. And actually, I think this kind of speaks to what you've been talking about as far as that international reach. There is just so much as we go through this list of remakes and other versions of these stories. But let's start with this one. This story, Swedish detective Jonas Engström travels to a small Norwegian town to investigate a teenage girl's murder. When he accidentally shoots his partner and covers it up, Engström becomes entangled in a psychological game with the murder suspect. As the perpetual daylight of the Norwegian summer and his guilt take a toll on his mental state, Engström's sleep deprivation and moral dilemma blur the lines between reality and delusion. Desperate to conceal his own culpability, Engström tampers with evidence and frames others, ultimately leading to a confrontation with the killer and the truth of his own actions. So, we're already out of the gate getting a story with a protagonist who's dabbling in right and wrong, right?
Absolutely. This is a key example, I think, of what Nordic Noir is to become. But it's also in its own right. It is I think it's an extraordinary piece of filmmaking as well. And you can see how this sort of the concept of the midnight sun can be used to advantage in film, which is so much about shadows and light. And we talked about film noir, the setting itself and the whole concept of this sort of the beginning of the deterioration of the detective as mirrored in this sort of the landscape and the midnight sun is just a great concept for a film that is interested more in the psychology of the detective than in the crime plot itself, because fairly early on we know who the killer is, we know what's going on, but it's really the sort of the slow deterioration of this detective and our realization that there is something in the closet, there are some things that are bound to come out as he sort of goes down this slippery slope in his sort of growing sense of guilt and knowing what has happened, and it is an attempt to cover it up. And the midnight sun, it's already announced in the beginning when he's flying to northern Norway. First of all, it's an interesting concept. We have the Swedish a Swedish cop going to Norway, to Tromsø.
I was wondering about that. Yeah.
That is kind of a strange thing to begin with. But there is that sense that he's being punished from something that he has done, and he's been sent to the furthest north, right? That is, as a punishment, which is something we also see in many of these films where the northern of the Nordic becomes sort of a real backwater and something where people go if they've been punished or if they can't stand things anymore, they return home in a way. The director, incidentally, is from Tromsø, so knew the setting really, really well, and is using the architecture of Tromsø really well as this midnight sun. And the midnight sun is announced right from the beginning in the airplane. That we have come to the land of the midnight sun, almost like a tourism announcement.
It sounds that way, yeah.
Yeah, it does. And then we just know that this is going to be really playing with his mind. He's trying to put up blankets in front of the windows, and there's always light coming through, no matter. So that becomes, I guess, a metaphor for his inability to cover up his own crime and to come to terms with his guilt. So which is really well made, of course, the film, the use of lights, the use of settings, the use of the architecture as well in the town really plays it. It's quite a grim story as well, isn't it?
It is really grim. Yeah. I mean, because you're really getting a sense of, the youth of this area and how there's not a lot to do there. So they're kind of coming up with their own things to do. And some of it ends up leading to some situations where they are getting into trouble, not necessarily like the murder, but certainly like doing some other things, like some of these other teenage characters that he ends up talking to, but also the one who does end up getting murdered, like she's drawn into these conversations with this author, and it turns into this, this tragic tale for her, that it does give you this sense that some people, like you, as you're finding out, some of these people have some information, but they're just like, they just don't necessarily want to be talking to this cop from Sweden coming in to shake things up, right? It's like, it's almost like an unspoken element with these people, and we certainly will see this in some of these other stories, like when we get to the Hunters, when we're talking about that one, about the people in these societies. It's a tragedy, but they're also like, let sleeping dogs lie sort of thing, and I get that sense with some of these teenage characters who just don't want to rock the boat or get themselves into trouble.
It's a small town story, isn't it? I think every tradition has these stories about small towns and the big cities. And definitely in the Scandinavian tradition, you have tons of novels and TV series and films that are exactly about this difference between the small towns, the big cities, the north, the south. And then there's all these sort of, stereotypes about life in the small towns, where there's these tight-knit communities. And I think they're probably less about, of course, this is not realism, right? So it's less about how things really are, but it's more about trying to understand what happens to a close-knit community. It could be a small town, it could be a family, it could be like a small nation state. What happens if you throw something in there that explodes, right? And that the fabric of trust, the fabric of people's sense of belonging, all these things, they start to come apart. And what ensues is often violence and silence about the violence, because you feel everybody feels guilty or part of it in some ways. So I think that becomes sort of a stereotype that is being used in much of this kind of fiction, where you have that small community that is being torn apart. And many of the characters here, they do represent that. And we have the detective who obviously is traumatized in some ways. And that is also another sort of trope that we see in Scandinavian crime. There's something has happened to them, and they're either coming back or they're going to some place where that kind of trauma becomes exposed, and they start acting irrationally, or they start acting exactly like the crimes that they're investigating. So especially in the Norwegian original of this film, Insomnia, we do see the sort of the latent violence in the cop as well, in Jonas Skarsgård's Jonas, and we find this in other films we are going to talk about as well.
Well, that was, it's funny because I was watching this with my wife, and it gets to the point where he is going to kill the dog so that he can have a bullet. And my wife is just like, oh, I can't, I don't like this guy anymore. I'm like, I don't think you're meant to like this guy. Like, that's not the story we're watching here. This isn't the American version. And that's,
no, the American
certainly
version is different.
Oh, yeah, it definitely changes things, especially by the time we get to the end. This one, it doesn't end in a way where you feel like he is going to make a change or anything. Like, the version ends with the local cop pointing out the fact that she recognizes that he had swapped some evidence around, but that's kind of it. It kind of drops, and it's just like, okay, well, now he's off on his way. You don't get that revelation that because my recollection of the American remake is he's just like, do what you have to do, like, you're a good cop, like, turn me in sort of thing. And it's not what we get here. We stay ambiguous.
The American version is heroic in a sense, right? I mean, anti-hero cop who becomes the hero in the end because he comes to terms with his own guilt and therefore he portrayed his thought. And luckily we are spared the killing of a dog, but also the sort of molestation of the young girl by the police officer. So there are lots of these sort of untidy things that we find in the Scandinavian narratives that have become cleaned up quite a bit. And another thing that's been cleaned up is exactly what is driving the plot, because one of the things I find disturbing about the Norwegian film is that there's really no good explanation for why things happen the way they do. They simply just happen to our cop, right? There's no rationale for him shooting his partner. That's just something that it's an accident. Whereas there's a sense that there might be some reasons why he would do it in the American version of it. There's an explanation that is intimated. And so when the perpetrator in the end, he falls his own death, there's no sort of real meaning to that. It just happens.
Yeah, right.
And so the cop, in a way, things happen to the cop, right? And we see some of these cops in Scandinavian stories that they might be great investigators out of a good tradition of police procedurals, but a lot of things just happen to them. Accidents happen. There's something in society. There's something in the air, in the landscape, something that does this to people. And how do we navigate that existentially? How do we come to terms with these things just happening and you're finding yourself in the middle of them, and they produce a lot of, anxiety in yourself. You come to terms with who you are as a person. So they're led to this sort of openness without any form of conclusion, I think, which is disturbing in itself, because lots of things have happened.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's interesting with this version as opposed to the American version is when we have the killer and the cop like interacting, they feel closer in this film than in the American. Like the American, it definitely feels like they're pushing at each other, trying to figure out how to best each other. And this one, it ends up feeling like there's more in common with them than not. And I find that fascinating. And Stellan Skarsgård always plays these sorts of characters so well. He's great as our lead.
An incredible actor who, of course, also had lots of films with Lars von Trier and others. So again, we see there is some connection between sort of really highbrow experimental cinema and the cast of these sort of more, I guess, popular formats or genre films, which is interesting.
And of course, he'll pop up in the American remake of Girl with the Dragon Tattoo as well.
He will, exactly, and lots and lots of other sort of Hollywood blockbusters. What a career! But I think what you're saying here about the not that much difference between the cop and the killer is something that you find in lots of these narratives as well. This proximity between the investigation and the investigator, between the cop and the killer, is something that is being worked through in different ways in this tradition. Not always with the same kind of outcome, I think, but in this one, it's much more existential, I think, in terms of coming to terms with your own guilt.
Yeah. The next film we're going to talk about, I don't think we quite go down exactly that same road with the cop and the killer, but there is some interesting elements in here, especially as we're exploring the cop. The next film is Jar City. This is 2006 from Baltasar Kormakur. We're going over to Iceland with this particular film. This takes place in Reykjavik. Inspector Erlendur investigates the murder of an elderly man named Holberg, found dead in his apartment with his skull bashed in. A photograph of a young girl's grave discovered at the crime scene becomes a key piece of evidence. As Erlendur delves into Holberg's past, he uncovers a web of dark secrets and hidden crimes spanning several decades. His investigation leads him to a series of cold cases involving rape, a rare genetic disease, and police corruption. Erlendur must confront the consequences of long-buried secrets while seeking justice in a society where the past is never truly forgotten. This, while he is a good cop, and he, may not necessarily fall in line with the killer in this one we're starting to get a sense, we're still getting a sense of some of that police corruption, and that's one of the key elements of this film. This is also something different in this film that we haven't seen, and I'm trying to remember if we end up seeing it in any of them, but it's actually jumping back and forth in time, which was a new element with this. That being said, it's Iceland and it still feels pretty cold and gloomy all the time.
Yeah, I mean, jumping back and forth in time as a narrative device, that is not something that is used that often, but I think there are more than this one. But you find some relationship between these crime stories and the Gothic tradition, particularly in the sense that there's always a past that comes back to haunt the present, whether it's a cold case, whether it's sort of Nazi past, historical things that have happened in the past that comes back to haunt both society, but also detectives, is a common trope in many of these stories that I think they get from the Gothic tradition, which you can also see in the visual style. There's a lot of Gothic elements in this one as well. What is similar, I guess, with this detective and Jonas we've just been talking about, is that it's focusing as much on his own relationships with his own past or with his own family, and that becomes part of the narrative as well, and establishing probably more as a common trope in this film, as we will see later on, the way that he cares for his daughter, who is a drug addict. And there is this amazing scene with him eating a sheep's head and reading from the Bible.
Amazing is one word for it.
Amazing is one word, but it flows me every time I watch it.
Wow,
I have seen it 100 times, but I can't get over it. It is really great acting. It's such a great scene. Another thing that is where I think this one differs slightly from this sort of psychological thriller that we saw in Insomnia is this one is really dealing with a contemporary Iceland at the time, with this sort of the DNA research. And I don't know if listeners will remember, but there was sort of in the mid-90s, there was this idea of this company that would map the entire genome of the Icelandic population. And it was said that this was a good idea because the Icelandic population is very homogeneous. So they're up there in the North Atlantic. There's not a lot of sort of different influences. So it's a very harmonious sort of gene pool, implied that this is one big family or one big nation family of harmony and homogeneity going back to the Icelandic sagas. So you can see how this plays into sort of an understanding of a national identity. And of course, there's probably not that much to this whole idea that the genome sequence of Icelandic people is this harmonious or homogeneous as was initially sold. But this is a very real project still ongoing to map the gene pool of a nation in order to come up with cures for hereditary diseases and other things. And that is sort of the driving engine behind the crime plot. And of course, this crime novel becomes very critical of the kind of suggested harmony that you find in this idea of a common genome, either in a nation or in a family. So again, we see this mirror image between a wider sort of national story or a social story, an ethical story really, and the implications of family in this. And so it is a family drama where the plot is around guilt, around carrying hereditary diseases and rape. And this is mirrored in our very quiet detective, who is constantly seen in situations where he has to deal with issues in his own family.
Yeah, right.
And he's incredibly quiet. I mean, that's something that surprises me, how little he's actually saying, but how powerful that the acting is. He's like an open book when you're reading his face in many ways.
Oh, he was a great, that's Ingvar Eggert Sigurðsson, and he was just a fantastic lead for us as he went through the motions of being a detective. And he feels like a detective, like when he and his partner are talking to the kind of the psycho in prison, and he is so completely unfazed by all the digs at his daughter that this psychopath is making, whereas his partner is the one who's more mentally affected by it. And I found that to be so fascinating in the way that he handled those sorts of situations. Like, he was so attuned to just like closing himself off personally. He was still dealing with it. You could tell, like, when he'd come home and he'd find his daughter just sleeping on the stairs outside of his door and bring her in and everything. Like, you could tell that there was still a lot of weight he carried with that all the time, but it never pushed into those dealings that he had with the criminal underworld and everything. And that was, it was a great performance. I enjoyed watching him immensely.
He's such a complex character who has to deal with so many different aspects of life as a professional policeman. It's one of the aspects I think many have commented on. And that these police procedurals in the Scandinavian tradition, they seem very realistic. Of course, they're not realistic, but the focus on the work of a policeman and also the emotional work of policemen in these situations, confronted with the kind of crimes that they're seeing, and then still trying to maintain a certain sense of normalcy or dignity in their own life world, and trying to keep those things apart where it is impossible, seems to be a very sort of psychologically realist in many ways to viewers. Absolutely.
Now, the title of the novel that this was based on, it's Mirin, which I guess translates to like the bog, which figures more into kind of the plot as far as like this bog that the victim's house is built upon. As we learn in the story, like he had buried something. It was built on a bog, and underneath the house they had buried a body, and that was kind of the whole key there. But also, I love that title because it feels like this, like the type of society, like the bog is just something that buries things and like holds it in, and it feels very interesting. And Jar City, I think, works definitely for that DNA story, the genetic, as we're studying these genetic diseases and everything, and as we learn things are stored there, that becomes kind of a key part of the story as well. But I guess I'm torn because it's two titles that kind of take you in different directions when you're understanding the sense of the story. But I do feel like the bog has something that feels maybe a little more Nordic Noir than Jar City,
Yeah, a bog would be perfect for Nordic Noir. But, I think I can completely understand that you're torn between those two titles, because I think the story itself is having those two images throughout the story. I mean, Erlendur, the detective, is himself referring to, in a great speech towards the end of the novel, is talking about a jar city for the whole nation. What are you doing here in this sort of gene company? You're constructing a jar city for the whole nation. You're tampering with families. You're tampering with past. You're tampering with all these things that are much more than this sort of scientific attempt to unlock the secrets of life so we can cure disease. And he's seeing sort of all the ethical, the social issues around this whole scientific exploration, which is about creating a nation of jars and specimens rather than actual people. And the bog is, of course, illustrating of the maybe a more sort of dystopian vision for a kind of society that is trying to map itself in this way, which is that everything will sink in a way into sort of this into this swamp. And I think that the timing of the story is also quite interesting around Iceland itself, which was, in the 90s, quite a sort of a economic wonder and would later on crash spectacularly. And so there is also this tension within a self-image of Iceland that is being negotiated, interestingly, in crime fiction of the time to try and I guess project some moral direction or critique of this kind of sort of self-celebratory, self-enclosed celebration of a homogeneous society without sort of any fear of the future.
It's a really fascinating story, the way that it unfolds and handles this crime. And again, going back to the personal stories that become kind of like what's buried in a family's past, as we come to the point where kind of the two interweaving stories fold into each other, and we kind of get to that point where the man who works for the genetic company ends up kind of coming into contact with our detective, and we kind of see those stories finishing at that cemetery over the grave of the young girl. We're really starting to kind of get this understanding of how everything comes together and the tragedy of the crime itself, and how like where who's the guilty party, who's innocent. And like that's what I found so interesting about this story, is it doesn't give you any easy answers at all, right? It's just you're just left at the end of this story going, oh God, like this, everything is just horrible.
Yeah, exactly. And that is produced by this idea that you're guilty for your own genes, in a sense, right? That's one thing of it, that he's a carrier of a gene that has killed his own child. And of course, he he feels responsibility for that, but it is impossible to live with the knowledge that this has happened through rape and through all these things that happened to his family, and that it goes back generations, which is another, I think, red thread in many of these stories about what has happened to you in the past is being reproduced in the present and will have consequences in the future, and who is then guilty. So the victims become the guilty. The one investigating them becomes the guilty because they can't really interfere, they can't intervene, they can't put things right. And in many ways, we have another detective here who becomes a bit redundant, really. I mean, he can only really stand there and just watch and see what is unfolding.
Yeah, by the time we get to the exactly.
Yeah, and that is another sort of desperation, I think, about that comes out of this film, is that in many ways you are just left with cleaning up after your addict daughter, carrying them when they need it, protecting them when they need it. But in the end, there's really not much you can do in terms of intervening. And I find that quite an interesting take on a crime story, isn't it? That there is something that just rolls on, without your ability to intervene, and that's a very desperate position, I guess, for a police detective who, like all of us, wants to find meaning in things and wants to find out, what is black, what is white, who is the guilty, who is the victim, and that plays with our sense of justice, I guess.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We can look back to Insomnia with that too, and just see the way that film ends as far as the wrapping things up with the killer. It's like, okay, but the whole thing ended. It was very, I don't want to say anticlimactic, but like you said, he just falls and that's it. He falls into the water and dies. And that's kind of the end of the killer. I find that to be such an interesting way for these stories to unfold, where you're just left with these situations where it's like things keep moving. Is anything better? Is society healed? Probably not. We're just going to kind of keep moving on. And hey, at least that's dealt with. And that's kind of where we're left.
And of course, we also left with the horrible crimes perpetrated against children by parents, which is another of the red threads we find in a lot of crime stories from Scandinavia, is really this investigate about hereditary guilt and about violence against children, violence against women, and how that affects people in the present, the children who survives, and the police that then investigates them. It becomes sort of reflections of a society where the past is still haunting, the crimes of the past are still haunting the present, and we find lots of these stories in the Hunters as well. We'll talk about later. We have violence against children that is playing with the children of the present.
Well, and speaking of, all of that is going to tie into our next film, which is perhaps the most well-known on this list, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the 2009 adaptation by Niels Arden Oplev, based on Stieg Larsson's novel, the first of the Millennium Trilogy. It was a very popular series of novels. The films were very popular, led to the American remake. This story, disgraced journalist Mikael Blomqvist is hired by wealthy industrialist Henrik Wanger to investigate the 40-year-old disappearance of his niece. Aided by the brilliant but troubled computer hacker Lisbeth Salander, Blomqvist uncovers a dark history of abuse, murder, and corruption within the Wanger family. As the two delve deeper into the case, they face increasingly dangerous threats from those who wish to keep the past buried. It's a gripping thriller that combines a complex mystery with biting social commentary on violence against women and the abuse of power in Swedish society.
Well, there we go, Andy.
Yeah, yeah, right. It's all right there. Yeah,
that sums it all up. Yeah. I mean, I think that speaks partly to the novel itself that Oplev was working with. Of course, that it is a novel that is just sort of all-consuming when it comes to crime genres and crime subgenres and what have you. And in the novels, there are lots of scenes where we have the different characters reading crime novels. So we know when they're reading Paretsky, we know they're on the right side. So there is sort of a real sort of conscious use of crime fiction tropes that Stieg Larsson is playing with. He was a consumer of crime fiction himself, as well as an investigative journalist. And it plays with the past. It plays with the assumed loss of a child in this Wanger family, in this sort of secluded islands. There we have sort of a locked room mystery or an island mystery that Mikael, who is a disgraced journalist, who's just had a libel case against him, he's sort of sent to this island there, and it's north. That's again very important, right? He's sent out
away from the city,
the city, up north. Where things will surely turn out out wrong.
Right.
And it's as if, he's been disgraced as a journalist, and he has to sort of regain. It's called in the Swedish a trust capital, förtroendekapital. He has to go and do this job as a journalist / detective in order to regain the trust that his magazine has lost because of the libel case. So in the case it's doing detective in order to show that you can have the trust of those, and that's why he goes, because he's been promised that if he solves the case of the disappeared young woman when she was a child, the industrialist Wanger will give him the pieces that he's missing, so he can finally get Wennerström. It doesn't turn out to be quite what he had hoped for. But so it's crime fiction by trial. This one, it's really interesting use of genre.
Well, and it's really tying into everything that we were just talking about with Jar City, as far as you've got rape, abuse against women, you've got abuse against children, you've got this sense of this society or the family drama where things are happening within the family that they're not talking about for generations, and then they're finally at this point trying to come to terms with that and deal with that. And that's a big part of Henrik Wanger, as he is this industrialist. He's got this family that's all tied into the family business. They're all various shades of gray or darker, and trying to and Blomkvist comes in and is trying to figure out who is good here. I think it seems pretty clear that Henrik Wanger at least seems like one of the good ones. But even he says any of them could have done it. You just get this sense that, who is this family? And that goes into kind of the socioeconomic thing too. They have all the money. They can kind of get away with what they want,
And they have. Part of the story is, of course, that he uncovers, with the help of Lisbeth Salander's hacker skills, uncovers this kind of Nazi past that this part of the family has, and this sort of the misogyny and the rapist tendencies have been inherited from father to son. That is part of course, what Mikael Blomkvist uncovers. And so that is the crime plot. And of course, the linking of sort of a Nazi past with sort of perpetrations of family against children is sort of what I talked about before, about this sort of recovery of ancient pasts, and things that have gone wrong in the past will come and haunt the present. That's all part of that sort of narrative, that there is that sort of a national past that is also a family past, right? That is a perpetration that has sort of ramifications for the present, and so sends out rings into the water of the whole nation, and sort of engulfs everybody. And it's the detective's abilities of putting together the big puzzle that will help us come to terms with, hopefully, what has happened in the past, and therefore hopefully put them to rest, and put things right. And you're right, Henrik Wanger is a good industrialist, of which the sort of Swedish welfare state was founded on. It's quite clear he's sort of one of those who would have gone together with the unions and formed this industrial welfare state back in the 60s, and he's sort of representation of that. And there are some other characters also representing the state, who are sort of the good characters, and then there are all the terrible characters.
Yeah, the local cop is a good guy. It's not a big character, but there's the local guy who from the paper. There are a few people that seem like they're the good ones. This one really paints the family as the bad one.
Yeah, but you also have the first caretaker of Lisbeth Salander. He's also a good character, right? He's someone who takes his job as a caretaker seriously, and he's almost a father figure to Lisbeth Salander, who is. We talk about Lisbeth Salander as though she is sort of an accidental character, but of course, at the time, and still, she was probably the main reason why this narrative, this story, became such a global sensation, because she's such an iconic figure. And also a very complicated figure, probably a bit more complicated than Mikael Blomkvist himself. So she is, of course, one who's been wronged by the system.
Yeah, well, and it's the Millennium Trilogy, but it's every book is titled after her, right? The girl with the dragon tattoo, the girl who kicked the hornet's nest, who played with fire.
Well, in the English translations, originally they were conceived as having sort of an overarching title, which in the Swedish would be Men Who Hate Women, which was seen as probably not selling too well in the English market, which is probably true. But they are stories about sort of men and misogyny and what has happened to this woman Lisbeth Salander in the name of the system, the secret police, and what have you. It's a crazy story, of course.
Yeah, and there's a lot over the whole trilogy that we'll discover. But even here in this film, I mean, you had mentioned early when we were talking about this, is that we'll find some strong female protagonists over the course of these stories. And this one's of the films that we're discussing here. This is the first one that we're coming to where we find that we have a really fascinating and unconventional, as you've kind of already pointed out, protagonist that we have in our character of Lisbeth here. And I mean, you could argue Mikael is probably more the protagonist, but she's certainly right up there with him as one of our principals here and a key character of the story. And she's definitely kind of challenging the traditional expectations that we've come to see so far in these sorts of films, which I find quite interesting.
A bisexual goth hacker with a massive dragon tattoo. Those have probably become more popular ever since, but it was a first for a lot of crime fiction, of course, to have this kind of character. She is a very present figure throughout the trilogy, of course, a central figure, and it is what has happened to her in her past with a father who was on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, that the secret police was sort of harboring in Sweden and sort of covering, and he violated his wife and Lisbeth's mother, and she has been in and out of institutions and caretakers, and she's being violated by her caretaker. And there's that, incredible famous scene of her sort of tattooing a racist, misogynist pig, a rapist pig, onto the body of him. So she was a new kind of heroine, I think, to many readers of crime fiction, but also when the film came out, a really in-your-face character who is, of course, not always on the right side of the law, but is sort of bending it to herself and becomes very powerful, partly through her ability to hack into computers and to reveal lots of things. And Mikael is quite happy in the end to use all the illicit information that she gives him in order to further his own cause. And they become like a really interesting pair, those two working together, attracted and to each other, but also leading different lives and sort of constantly circling around each other. It's an interesting dynamic between the two of them.
Yeah, a real yin-yang sort of vibe that you have with them over the course of which is interesting.
Both coming from the children's literature tradition of Sweden, interestingly. Maybe your listeners will remember Pippi Longstocking, and Lisbeth Salander is modeled on a grown-up Pippi Longstocking, and what would she do when she became like in her 20s rather than 8 years old. And we know her apartment is called Villa Villakulla in the second film, in the second series, which is, of course, the name of Pippi Longstocking's house. And Mikael is constantly being teased with the fact that he sounds like one of Astrid Lindgren's master detectives, Blomqvist, who is sort of this sort of do-gooder Boy Scout detective who helps the police to catch the criminals, sort of one of these sort of young adult detective stories. So they're playing with these conventions about Swedish sort of archetypical children characters, and of course, Pippi Longstocking always sort of on the edge of society, an outsider who is constantly trying to help out the good and fight evil in society.
Yeah, interesting. This film all takes place in Sweden, right? Is there anything to be said in this world of Nordic Noir that we haven't touched on yet? Thinking about, like, this film is all Sweden, the last film was all Iceland, but Insomnia was a Swedish detective who had gone to Norway, and that's the first one, or where we're really kind of getting that potential conflict between countries in these films. We'll see that here and there in this, but in the circle of Nordic Noir, how often is that a trend?
Well, most spectacularly in the TV series The Bridge, which is where it's sort of the whole dynamic between the two detectives, that there's these cultural differences, and they will be well known to Scandinavians watching it. And in Insomnia, it's also used as, they don't understand him when he's speaking to the young people in the school, for instance.
Right.
So it's an outsider character again, right? When you cross borders, you become an outsider, and there are all these sort of implied cultural conflicts or differences that is maybe related mostly to sort of teasing each other and showing up differences and stereotypes of different nationalities.
Yeah, because I know, I think, and I can't remember if it's the Department Q that we're going to talk about or one of the other ones. I ended up watching a couple of those because they're enjoyable. But there is one where they're going from Denmark across over to Sweden, I think, and having some trouble with the local police and having getting kicked out of the country and stuff like that. So I feel like there are some times where they are kind of doing that, and
that's true. Yeah, that's true. It's an interesting region in that sense, right? Because before the European Union, there were still quasi-open borders between them. So you can move somewhat freely between the different nations. There are some, a lot of long history about sort of internal colonization, have you, switching of some areas have been, part of one nation, then as part of another. So there's lots of sort of historical baggage. And they've also done things differently in many ways. They have different historical relationship with the Second World War, for instance. Norway, tried to put up resistance. Denmark, capitulated right away. Sweden was neutral. They have different histories with NATO. They have different histories in relationship to of course, the Soviet Union in the before the fall of the wall, of course. So there are lots of different histories and therefore and different takes on citizenship as well. So there are lots of differences that Scandinavians will notice when you're watching these films, especially when they then cross into another culture. Lots of implied, sort of, often done with a sense of humor and sort of nudging.
Right. Well, and I mean, not that it fits into our conversation necessarily, but even the original version of Speak No Evil, I think it's a Danish and a Dutch couple that end up, kind of meeting in Tuscany, and that leads to the whole story. And so I feel like there is this trend of these countries, they're all close together. And, I suppose coming from the States where it's like crossing from state to state, we don't have quite the same sense of that. But I do think it's interesting when you go from country to country, there's just those little differences that everybody has,
Well, you also have an American culture, with the North and the South, the East and the West. I mean, there's lots of sort of similarities. They might speak the same language, but there are also, stereotypes of differences and assumptions about who belongs what and what they are. So
there's Texas and California. There are some states that definitely feel different.
Exactly.
Well, let's move on to our next film, probably my favorite of all the films on our list. It's Morten Tildum's 2011 film, Headhunters, based on is it Jo Nesbø? Is that how you say it?
Jo Nesbø.
Jo Nesbø.
Most people call him Joe Nesbø. So that's fine, I guess.
I know. That's my Americanization of his name. Okay. The 2008 novel. This film, we're following Roger Brown, who is a successful corporate headhunter who also leads a double life as an art thief to maintain his lavish lifestyle and keep his wife content. When he meets Klaas, a former mercenary with a valuable painting, Roger sees an opportunity for a major heist. However, the theft sets off a dangerous game of cat and mouse, as Klaas proves to be far more ruthless and cunning than anticipated. As Roger's carefully constructed life unravels, he must use all of his skills to stay one step ahead of his pursuer and uncover the truth behind Klaas's motives. Headhunters is a gripping, darkly comedic thriller that keeps audiences on the edge of their seats. This film is a shift because suddenly we're no longer following any police at all or any detective work, really.
Yeah, exactly right. This is also, if you think about Jo Nesbø, you're probably thinking about the Harry Hole novels, of which there are many now, and probably for what he's most well known. We can talk about The Snowman later on as being an adaptation of one of those many novels. And this came out of the blue, I think, for most people when it came out in 2011. It's one of Nesbø's standalone novels, of which he has also written quite a few. It doesn't really fit within the Nordic Noir police procedural genres,
right? Yeah,
which is great, I think, because there are actually quite a lot of films and also novels that really don't fit within that sort of schema, or in that genre. But there might still be things that are somewhat similar or something particular to Norway in this sense. And I think one of the underlying sort of cultural aspects of this is this idea of a society that is really pumped up with a high volume economy and consumer culture. And I think that is something that Jo Nesbø, as a writer, and very prominently in the Harry Hole novels, that is something he's always returning to. He's also writing about Nazi past, but he's really writing about what is happening to Norway in the wake of all the oil wealth that has come into the country, what has happened to people's sense of morality, their sense of aspirations, the kind of values that are in the Norwegian society, going from a completely different low economy to this high performing economy, which was still at this point is fairly recent, going back to the 60s and 70s. So I do think we find some remnants of a cultural critique in there. You don't think about that as much when you're watching them, because it's just a high paced, constantly flip-flopping story of pursuit. So our main character, he's a headhunter as a profession, so he's trying to find the best people for the high-performing companies. And he has, in the beginning, there's this talk about how to become ready to take on a big job in this company. You don't do that by having all the right things. You have it by reputation, right? So you have to go.
It's all about reputation, right?
Exactly. So you have to go about roundabout ways, bending stories in order to increase your reputation, and then you'll just slot in easily, right? So it's all about performance.
It's a fascinating conversation. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Well, which plays into him and his role over the course of the film, both as an art thief and this corporate headhunter. It also plays into Klaas in the way that he, without ever having the conversation about reputation, ends up setting us up so much for exactly all of that. Like, I think too, after they've been playing squash and they're in the locker room, and he notices all the scars on his body, and they're having this conversation about the work that he did when he was a mercenary and everything. And like all of this is painting this picture of Klaas and his reputation in his mind, and it without realizing, or perhaps going so far as to think about what are the ramifications if I actually steal from this guy, and I think that's what's so fascinating is how that changes. And I do think that there is something interesting in just the scope of Nordic Noir and these crime thrillers and just the range. And I think this is an important part of the conversation, is because, they're not all going to be detective thrillers, but you're still going to, it still can fit into this subgenre. And I think we're looking at some of that evolution within this subgenre to get to a point where we're having a story like this, he ends up being a good guy, right? He's an art thief, but we totally fall for this character and his relationship with his wife, and we start seeing how all of that unfolds. Yes, there's a lot of moral ambiguity that we have with this character, but as he learns his lesson, I guess you could say, over the course of the story, we're kind of right there with him and buying into this journey that he takes. And I find that interesting within the context of what we've been talking about, some of these complex detective characters and the learning and the processing and the themes that involve their characters as they're going through their own lives as they solve these crimes.
Honestly, I get a little bit annoyed with Jo Nesbø here, because I think I'm being played just as much as they're being played in the story, because he's such an unappetizing human being, this guy, right? He's just the worst, because he's completely superficial. All this, he's sort of so down on him being only 160 something. That's completely ridiculous thought, right? And then he's just pumping all this money, stealing art, so his beautiful wife will have, so all these assumptions about what people have, all this high society, superficial. He's the worst kind of character you can imagine, right? Having a conversation with him would be impossible without feeling terrible. And I cannot understand how I start feeling empathy for him or sympathy, or I want him to win. And it's just, he does all the wrong things for all the wrong reasons, but still I'm rooting for him. And of course, that's partly because the other character is so unappetizing himself, played by Nikolaj Coster-Waldau, that people will know from a very famous television series, Game of Thrones. And he really plays that part with a sort of an iron face as well. He's so unappetizing himself. So probably in the contrast, you can sort of say, okay, that's fine. I'll have one over the other. But it's all about being tricked all the time. And I think the viewer is being tricked as well, just as the art thief is being tricked by this being the Rubens painting that he has that he wants to steal is really a copy. He thinks the right thing, and he wants to produce a copy to replace the copy. I mean, it's just so much fun, and you just want him to win all the time, and he's just making the wrong decisions all the time for all the wrong reasons. I still want him to win.
Well, and I think it's because they really put him through the ringer. And I think he hasn't got when he has to climb down into the outhouse, like starting from that point forward, it's like, okay, I'm starting to root for this guy because he's having to like really, he's bottomed out, and now we get to see him rebuild himself. And actually it's like the conversations later with his wife that allow for those that human side to really develop as he learns his lessons. And I think it's a comeuppance sort of film. Like he has to understand all of those mistakes that he's made. And it makes for a powerful journey. I love it. The idea of like this double life and this criminal, I mean, do we get that sort of story outside of this more in Nordic Noir?
Yeah, I have no idea. I can't remember any good examples of this. I'm sure there must be.
Yeah.
Come to think of it, I can't really think of it now.
Interesting.
But it is one of those, there's a lot of psychological realism in crime narratives. I went back to some from a Danish neorealist, one, Anders Bodelsen from the 60s in Denmark, whereas this guy who dresses up as a Santa Claus and sticks up a bank and stuff, I mean, where you also have these sort of identities, the pursuer becomes the pursued, and you have these sort of displacements of who is the guilty one and what's going on, and how this psychological impact has on this sort of individual and how they grow with it. And when they've been down in the toilet, they come up at the end. So there are some similar narratives, but not quite to this sort of high concept idea that Nesbø carried out. And he's just such a master of genres, Nesbø, which is, I mean, one of the reasons why probably, half of the translated books sold in the UK over the last 10 years have been Nesbø novels. He's an incredible force in the publishing business. And
holy cow,
strangely enough, not more of his books have been turned into, been adapted for film yet, but he's also written a really good, really interesting TV series called Occupied that came out quite a few years ago, but really sort of plays with the dystopian idea of Russia taking over Norway and threatening Europe. So there is some premonition in there.
Yeah, right. Was that original or like written for the screen?
That's original, written for television, yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
He's also written children's novel. We talked about Astrid Lindgren with her Master Detective stories. He's also written a series of famous children's stories and what have you. He's a very prolific writer.
Yeah. Well, and, I guess that, while this film may feel different from some of these detective stories we're following, obviously it ties in with so many of these authors being so key to kind of like the development of this subgenre, right?
No, absolutely.
Well, let's talk about our last film on this list, Gustav Møller's 2018 film, The Guilty, another one with a recent American adaptation. Oscar Holm, a police officer demoted to emergency dispatcher duty, receives a distressing call from a kidnapped woman named Iben. Confined to the dispatch office, Oscar must use his limited resources to unravel the mystery and save Iben. As the night unfolds, he discovers the case is more complex than it initially appeared, forcing him to confront his own demons while navigating a tense, high-stakes situation. The Guilty is a gripping single-location thriller that engages the audience through clever storytelling and Jakob Stougaard-Nielsen's powerful performance as Oscar. As I just mentioned, we're doing another little playing with some of the conventions within Nordic Noir. It's all set in one location. It's all set in this emergency dispatch office, which is, I don't know, it feels wholly unique from all the ones that we've, certainly of the ones we discussed, but I mean, are there others that kind of take this approach?
No, not in Scandinavian cinema as far as I mean, it's not the first one internationally to do this or to do a part of this, but it is incredible to do a crime story and something that could be a police procedural in this way, that a genre that relies so much on chases and action and lots of characters interacting with each other, violence on screen and what have you. And here, everything is close-up images of the dispatcher and soundtrack that is, and the
so
sound
important.
that we hear on the phone, which is voice actors who are all brilliant, and the editing here is really important. Interestingly, this was also, I think it was a debut film for Müller, who directed this, a young filmmaker, fairly recently out of the film school in Copenhagen. And most of the people involved in making the film were from that year in the film school. And they got a little bit of funding from one of the big production companies, Nordic in Scandinavia, to do sort of try something out. And this is what they come up with. So, of course, it's another example going back to Dogma 95, the Trier and Winterberg, all those where they make sort of something good out of a necessity, right? There's not a lot of money in Danish film production, so let's come up with some rules for making interesting stories in a low budget way. So the actors here, they obviously didn't have to bring in their own costumes, and there is artificial lighting and there's editing, which you didn't have that much of in the Dogma movies.
No,
but it was
right,
really
yeah.
it was filmed over only like 13 days, a couple of weeks, and really working with these long shots that makes it's very intense to follow the main character going about his business in this call center for 112. It's called in Denmark, I think.
Yeah, right. And they find ways to amp up the tension in this simple location. Initially, he's in the room with the other callers, and it's late at night, so there's only a few people in there. But then he decides, I need to take this into I don't know what it is, but it's kind of like the private room for when they're having an intense call or something. He shifts to that, which is a very dark room, and he can close the blinds and everything, and it allows for him to separate himself more from the other people, but also it just kind of creates more of this tense, closed-in sense for us. It's just very minimalist and dark and confined, and I think that's
very intense.
Yeah, and then you're watching for that little red light to pop up when the call comes in.
But you also have the feeling that he shouldn't really be doing this, right? I mean, so he's not supposed to be in this situation, and he's taking his job he takes the job too far. We get this when he's calling the other dispatchers saying, well, you shouldn't be investigating this, you just put the calls through. Yeah. So he's making something really personal, which is something we recognize from a lot of the crime stories. We have a Wallander character, right? Also with the famous cops who are also making things very personal all the time, right? So they're not playing by the rules. They make things personal. They take them in directions where they shouldn't take them. They take responsibility and they interfere with the stories where they shouldn't be interfering. And that's what happens, I think, when he goes into this room. He knows that he's not supposed to be doing this, but now he's doing his own investigation while he's kept away from actually being on the beat. We learned that he's been taken away from police duty due to something that has obviously gone wrong, that is sort of part of the narrative as well, that he has done something in the past that he's being punished for, and he will, the day after, if he behaves, he will come back into the job that he really wants to do.
Yeah, he's got this trial the next day that he has to go before a judge and confront whatever crime that he and his partner had he had committed, his partner had covered up, is kind of the sense that we get. And I love the way that the storytelling it allows for that to slowly come out over the course of it. We don't get a big expository moment at the beginning where, why you're here, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It's just, it unfolds very slowly, and we never really get a sense as to what actually happened. I think the American version works to make that so much more clear, but it's something obviously troubling. And this ties right into our very first conversation that we had about Stellan Skarsgård's character in Insomnia. He's done something wrong and he's sent somewhere else as a form of punishment. That's exactly what we're getting here as he's getting ready for this trial.
Exactly. And again, we find a story where, I mean, you're absolutely right, this sort of slow unfolding of his own personal story, his own personal sense of guilt, or he's also trying to cover something up, just as Stellan Skarsgård's character was in Insomnia. And that slow unfolding that has to go in hand with the investigation of the crime, or the solving of the ongoing and unfolding perceived crime, what is going on. Those two things, they have to go in sync together, and they become revealed in the end, how one feeds into the other, or how they are mirror images of each other. And the the title, the guilty, is exactly playing with this kind of understanding or find out what do we mean by being guilty, and how does he understand guilt through the crime that he's investigating. So the crime that he's investigating is giving him a perspective on his own situation. Whether it becomes clearer is to be seen.
Well, and it really is like, who is the title referring to, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's the other thing we're getting, because it's such an interesting element of this story that he's investigating of this horrible crime where a child has been killed, and we're getting the sense that this woman has been kidnapped by her husband who killed this kid. She's calling him from the car secretly, trying to like talk in code so that he understands what's going on, and he starts honing in on this. And then later, everything shifts and he has to rewire his entire perspective of everything that's happened. And quickly, because the cops are, everything is happening where the cops keep closing in more and more as they're pursuing them. And it's just, again, really boils down to how the sound design plays as we're getting these calls coming in over the course of this. And it's a tense ride.
It's so effective. It's surprisingly effective. And with these I seem to remember the American version. The child doesn't actually die in the end. But there we have the grimmer Danish or Scandinavian version, just like the dog in Insomnia. Actually, no dog was actually killed on set. But and here's a story. So they've been tidied up a bit.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But it is a really grim unfolding story, and he's being led astray by somebody, if not cunning in this case, like in Headhunters, then somebody who has a mental illness and being led astray without being able to understand, and then this sort of is revealed to him through his interactions. But his assumptions is so much a part of the personality that we're seeing of this cop that he would immediately go to an understanding of who did this, as would the viewer, having seen all these things about misogyny and violence against women. We will immediately see this story as the scene.
We've been watching all this Nordic Noir. We already know what to expect.
and we're being fooled again, which is nice to see that Nordic Noir is still surprising. You still have finding ways to tell a story that plays with conventions and can surprise the viewers. But again, it is a story where we see the makeup of this policeman as not wholly, he's not a really nice guy, right? I mean, he's short-tempered. Something has happened to him. He's violent. He jumps to conclusions. He's taking charge on things he shouldn't take charge on, and he puts people in dangerous situations without understanding them fully. So in that sense, he's probably also a relatable character, right? He's not a super cop who can sort of read minds and find traces. He's being exposed to the story as just like a reader would.
Right. Well, and as we've been discussing, like, he is somebody who over the course of the story is recognizing elements within himself, and actually we see make some changes as he ends up having that conversation later with his partner saying, you know what, just don't lie for me, just tell the truth. And we're getting a sense he's grown, and we don't know what the results are. It's unclear what's going to happen as he walks out the door at the end, but that at least we know that internally, like, he has flipped a switch and things have changed. Yeah,
that seems to be the case. Very different from Insomnia in that sense. There is the possibility of somebody coming to terms with their own guilt and taking some sort of responsibility. Though he's asking his partner not to testify, to just speak what he wants and to say the truth as he sees it. But he's also put his partner in a very, very difficult situation.
Right. Yeah, he's not going to get out of that.
No. So it's hard to see where it ends. But all good crime movies ends with some openings, and a lot of the Nordic Noir stories they end up with asking more questions and keeping more possibilities open than actually closing them down. They're quite untidy. And the big long novel series are a good example of this. The Wallander stories, the Sherwin Valley stories, they do keep lots of doors open to possibilities, which I think increases audience participation in interesting ways.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Well, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute, and then we will discuss more about Nordic Noir's impact and its legacy. Hey, Pete, have you ever been fascinated by the allure of secret societies throughout history?
Are you kidding me right now, Andy? I live for this stuff. From the Freemasons to the Illuminati, I am obsessed with these clandestine groups. The Rosicrucians and their ancient wisdom, the Skull and Bones Society at Yale with its powerful alumni network. I'm drawn to them. There's something about how they offer this exclusive access to hidden knowledge. They totally capture my imagination. It's like they give this sense of belonging to something greater than oneself.
Wow, sounds like you're looking for one yourself.
Do you even need to ask? Where do I sign? How much blood do I have to give? Are there any required tattoos or brands involved? Is it my first or second born that they need?
Well, what if I told you that there's a secret society for film lovers right here at the Next Reel family of film podcasts, all proud members of the True Story FM network, and you don't have to give any blood or either of your kids?
You've got my attention, Andy. What can you tell me about this cinematic brotherhood?
When you become a member of the Next Reel family, you gain access to a treasure trove of exclusive content, early episode releases, and a community of passionate film enthusiasts who share your love for movies. It's like being initiated into a secret order where you're privy to the inner workings of our shows, including the Next Reel, the Film Board, Movies We Like, Sitting in the Dark, and CinemaScope.
But Andy, as a member, will I unlock a world of bonus content from extended conversations and behind-the-scenes insights to exclusive pre-show and post-show discussions that expand the conversations about the films we love?
Why, yes, the true power of this secret society lies in its community. As a member, you'll join an exclusive group within our Discord community where you can engage in clandestine conversations with other passionate film fans in our members-only channels.
But what about live recordings, Andy? The sacred rituals of any good cinematic order. Will these episodes be scheduled in advance so that members like me will know when to gather around the virtual pyre in real time via YouTube?
Ah, yes. Perhaps the greatest secret of all is that by becoming a member, you're not just investing in your own entertainment, you're also supporting the tireless work of our independent creators and helping to keep the magic of cinema alive and well. So if you're ready to join this elite group of film lovers and unlock the secrets of cinema, head over to truestory.fm/join. For just $5 a month or $55 a year, you will gain access to a world of exclusive content, engaging discussions, and a community that shares your passion for movies. Head to truestory.fm/join to sign up.
Andy, I can't wait for you to welcome me into the inner circle of the Next Reel family of film podcasts. I'll see you in the secret chambers. Now, when do I get my ring?
Well, we don't actually offer rings with your membership.
Tattoos or brands? When can I do that?
No tattoos.
Secret handshakes?
Tell you what, you and I can come up with our own secret handshake, okay?
No, I mean, at the very least.
We've talked through a bunch of films. We've talked about kind of like where Nordic Noir came from and everything, but we've talked a little bit about its global recognition in cinema, international film, TV, and its popularity. But like beyond that, I mean, do you see it growing like with its cultural impact that it's been having within the Scandinavian countries, but also like how the rest of the world is like perceiving the Scandinavian countries?
Yeah, those are big questions. I think on the one hand, you can see that in terms of the productions of visual and audiovisual storytelling in Scandinavia, that is a huge business now, and it's a business that is internationalized. So a lot of the film and television productions that we're seeing over the last 10 years have become increasingly international because they are small markets in the Nordic countries. Of course, they also have an internal market of subtitling and translation between them, but I mean, the market compared to bigger European markets is just minuscule. And for telling these stories in the kind of production values that the ambition is now, you do need to have funding from abroad. And I think a lot of the Scandinavian narratives are funded by ZDF International or German producers or from other countries. So co-production is really big. We've seen a lot of the Danish or Scandinavian actors, filmmakers, getting work abroad. Ulrik Thomsen being one of the great ones, of course, to go through many of these, the whole film industry in Denmark and ending up in James Bond movies, what have you. And we talked about Stellan Skarsgård. So there's a lot of internationalization going on in terms of the production culture in Scandinavia. In terms of the market for literature, it's been a massive change in international rights. So in many cases, rights to translate novels happens at the same time as they've been accepted for publication in their local markets. That much attention. So every time there's some hype around the Scandinavian crime novel, of course, they come out on the big fairs and stuff, and then they're being bought up for international rights in the hope to find another Stieg Larsson, which was, of course, famously only picked up by really small independent presses who made tons of money because nobody believed in it. So yeah, it's become a very sort of a globalized production companies productions we see now, which is an interesting development, and I think is producing high quality television shows, but still very much driven by now a much broader talent pool in Scandinavia of actors and writers. I mean, I think it's probably a bit of a game now to watch a Scandinavian television series, then recognize where you've seen these actors before, because there's only so many of them. They all come in different television series and in films and what have you.
Yeah, there's definitely some repetition, which
there is a lot of repetition,
fine.
which just is the nature of the game. And of course, you have to have really good actors to be able to pull that off, and good directing and good scripts. And I do think there is a really productive also crossover between the different media. So you have writers of novels becoming screenwriters, and screenwriters becoming novelists, also that. So there's a lot of dynamic going on. And then in terms of adaptations and remakes, you have mentioned that several times. That still seems to be true, that adaptation simply has become the name of the game, particularly in the American markets, and the buying up of formats is something you see. There's a lot of attention on that, so they're making money on it.
And I mean, it's interesting that there is even a growing trend. I don't know if it's because of Nordic Noir, but it seems to be, of other sort of regional noir from around the world. We're starting to see more Mediterranean noir and Asian noir and Celtic noir. And we're starting to see these. I don't think any of them have reached the popularity, but I just think it's interesting that it's created this influx of other places wanting to kind of have their own versions of it,
It's really hard to remember a time before, I said that flippantly, a time before Nordic Noir, but simply in a time before multi-European, different kinds of languages were actually ending up on our screens. I mean, from perspective of the UK, there weren't really any subtitled drama on sort of the main television channels in the UK before The Killing and before the running of the Wallander television series, which is, only 2009, around that time. Before then, you couldn't find any. And the only reason why they ended up on BBC4 was because they were trying to find a new identity for themselves, buying cheap content that they could sort of identify as sort of the highbrow channel. And they found this cheap television series called Forbrydelsen, or the Killing, and they ran with it. And since then, multiple TV channels have marketed themselves as running sort of international, European, or global television, and they all learn from each other. And I think we saw in the early 2010s, we saw a lot of Welsh, British, Scottish television series that clearly borrowed from the storytelling and the stylistics of the Nordic Noir television series that were so popular, and sort of broadened them out and had way many more viewers than the Nordic Noir series. So it became a way to create local stories in a recognizable international package. And I think that has made a huge difference. Now, of course, shortly after that, you have all the streaming channels, you have all the streaming platforms where these things, they live. And a few weeks ago, I counted how many Nordic Noir television series I could at any point in time find on all the platforms, and I counted more than 30, which is just insane. That you can find this many. I mean, historical ones and new ones, but that is a huge difference in the global market for international film and TV, I think.
Well, it's interesting, and I don't know if we can completely say that this is because of Nordic Noir and that shift, or it's just this nature of streaming services, but I am seeing more and more of different series in different languages on streaming services now than ever before, and I think that could have been a shift from Nordic Noir way back then, and then just streaming services made that shift easier. But, I don't think that like the finding something like Squid Games having the popularity that it did would have necessarily been an easy thing had we been, in the 90s still, right?
Absolutely. And it has given really, I think, and many people, they watch television series as though they're like tourism films, right? You experience something about another culture, which is, I think, is fantastic, right? Because they are local stories, just like the Danish ones are. How do we tell a Danish story the American way? That's what some of the production team said when they went to the NYPD Blue to see how they did American television series.
Yeah, right.
And how do we use that format to tell a local story? I mean, that to me is sort of the global dimension of it. And you see all these different series of Mexican narco-novellas. You see all these different kinds of stories coming out of different African productions that really tell the stories of local understandings and local issues, but in a format that is transferable, that we can understand, or we can at least try to understand, because we know the language, the visual language, the narrative language, but we still get a lot of sense of these being different places that have different issues they deal with, and they are connected in interesting ways.
Right. That's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah.
Are there any criticisms that Nordic Noir faces? As far as, I don't know, we could argue oversaturation because there is so much of it, and perhaps we can fall into the formula of this sort of crime thriller. But I mean, are there any other real issues?
Oh God, yes.
Okay.
Well, first of all, the term itself is obviously completely meaningless, but I beg to differ. But it probably has to be understood in certain ways. But yes, there has been lots of criticism about misogyny, the representation of violence against women. Is that just to get more people to watch the scenes, or is it feeding into this kind of narrative genre stereotypes instead of working through them? And there will always be a tension there, from the spectacularization of rape, and all these things are constantly things that one has to be vigilant about. I think both when you're producing, but also watching these television shows, the amount of violence. I mean, we have talked about a few examples here where American versions have sort of tidied up a little bit the violence against animals and children, and that is, of course, something that is being debated about the need for all this sort of visual violence, and as an important part of the stories. Why do we need it, and do we actually need to see it? And what does it do to us as viewers that we see all this violence, and that it has that it's gendered as well? Is it telling true stories about our societies, or are they just rehashing sort of old narratives and stereotypes that are not really as obvious? And others would say, well, they are still issues that we need to work through. And then, of course, there's been quite a lot criticism about some stories about indigenous peoples, such as the Sami, indigenous people in Greenland, the Inuit there, and whether crime stories are simply exoticizing those peoples and their cultures in order to tell a story for a majority audience. So that tension will always be there with genre film. I think it's very difficult not to have that as part of the consideration when you are still thinking about these stories. I guess I think that's how I mostly like to see them, as trying to work through or present some of the issues there are in society. But of course, there's always the danger that these stories become sort of exotifications or stereotyping.
Yeah, inevitably that becomes a challenge with these types of stories. But I think, I don't know, the way that I feel is we're delving into these stories with a lot of humanity also. We're really looking at the cops, or just these characters' internal struggles that they're also going through. And we're not seeing that with all of the characters in the stories, but I do think that they're largely trying to paint honest human portrayals in the characters. And that's something that seems to ring true with all of these as I'm watching them.
Yeah, I think they want to engage us, right? They want to engage us as viewers and as readers for us to start thinking about what we are seeing, and how we take sides, or how we're being manipulated with, or who we empathize with, and whether things ring true to us or not. I mean, I think they are open. It is an open genre. I think most people talk about crime fiction as a very closed genre that's always ending up with with sort of the hegemony reestablished and stuff. But I don't think that's the case with Nordic Noir. I think it is the better of the narratives are really open and engaging audiences to take stands. But of course, you can interpret them as closed as some have interpreted Mankel's stories, for instance, as sort of just rehashing the old racist stereotypes that are already there. And academics as well are divided on issues about representation of that.
Yeah. Last question, kind of closing things up. What's the future of Nordic Noir? Like, where do you see it going from here?
It's a good question. I think I've been asked that many times over the last 10, 15 years, and I don't think I'm ever right. So I should be careful. I think I famously said that back in 2012 that this is going to be over in a few years.
Oh,
it's not. So I'm very careful. I did say in the documentary going back in 2011 that the future is turning away from local stories to more global stories and also to more gore and violence. I think Nordic Noir since then has certainly delivered. I do think, though, in the production cultures of these nations that there is such a rich tradition of crossover between different filmmakers, about television, different kinds of storytelling. And I think there has become, people are much less cautious about making genre films. It was one of the Dogma 95 dogmas was you are not allowed to do genre film. You're not allowed to have guns on set. And those things have of course changed. And Lars von Trier famously made his own sort of horror film television series in the mid-90s that has been incredibly influential with handheld cameras and what have you. So I think we will see much more diverse stories. And I think we'll also see more stories delving into some of the more uncharted territories of Scandinavian, if not psyche, then at least geography. We have seen some interesting co-productions around dealing with issues around indigenous peoples in the north. We have also started seeing some examples of what we would call eco-crime. There are also stories dealing with colonialism in Greenland and so on and so forth. So I think we will continue to see genres that are dealing with more sort of uncomfortable truth and uncomfortable pasts in Scandinavia. But I think we also will see a continuing internationalization of these formats, and I'm looking forward to seeing really new and interesting global formats making their way into a Scandinavian genre, and to see what happens when non-American or non-British genre formats becomes part of a Scandinavian discourse, I think. So I think it's open, really, but I think I've been proved wrong. It's still going strong, and it's multiplying, it's diversifying, it's crossing over. So I think we can just hope for, interesting stories, really, in whatever hybrid form they might come in the future.
Absolutely. Well, Jakob, it's been a great conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining me. You've got some books that you have written. Do you want to plug your books real quick?
Well, I can send your listeners to my book, which is it has a very complex title, Scandinavian Crime Fiction, so that should be easy to remember, which really tries to look at the literary tradition mostly, but it also goes into television. But it really looks at the interrelationship between Scandinavian crime fiction from Sjöwall and Wahlöö and all the way up till today, in light of developments in the welfare state and the sort of changing social and political situation in Scandinavia. So if your listeners have been interested in that, I will just send them in that direction. And if your listeners are more interested in Scandinavian stuff more generally, we have produced a free book that you can find from UCL Press. You just look at the Introduction to Nordic Cultures. You'll find lots of articles there on all aspects of Nordic cultures and histories, and that's freely available.
Fantastic. And, you should also just plug, you've got the Nordic Noir book club that people can learn more about, right?
Yeah, that has been a bit quiet, but that has been going on since 2010. It's been a bit quiet lately, but we had some wonderful events. So if listeners are ever in London, you should look us up. But we have a blog with lots of interesting stories, lots of podcasts there from events going back to 2010 that might be interesting to have a re-listen to. One of the things is we have an early producer of the English version of the Wallander stories talking to us as it grew, this story there. So there should be some content there for your listeners to engage with as well.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have links in the show notes, so everybody check all of that out. Again, Jakob, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with me today.
A real pleasure, Andy. Thank you very much.
Next month, we'll embark on a wild and audacious journey through the world of remake-exploitation. We'll explore how filmmakers from Turkey to Indonesia have boldly disregarded copyright laws to create their own unauthorized versions of popular films, all in the hopes of cashing in on the success of the originals. From the bustling streets of Istanbul in Turkish Star Wars to the supernatural terrors of Bollywood's Nightmare on Elm Street, we'll discover the bizarre delights and surprising revelations that await in this fascinating corner of international cinema. Join us as we examine why this trend has emerged as a distinct film movement, particularly in certain parts of the world, and how these daring remakes challenge our understanding of genre, adaptation, and cultural appropriation. Thank you for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network. Music by Orcus and Blackbard. Find us and the entire Next Reel family of film podcasts at truestory.fm. Follow us on social media at The Next Reel, and please rate and review us if your podcast app allows. As we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious.
Andy, according to my friend Internet, this is what Letterboxd is. Letterboxd is a global social network for grassroots film discussion and discovery. Use it as a diary to record and share your opinion about films as you watch them, or just keep track of films you've seen in the past. Showcase your favorites on your profile page.
That is a lot.
You bet it is. That's why I want you to tell our fair listeners just one thing you do with Letterboxd that has changed the way you watch movies. Let them have it.
Okay, are you ready for this?
So ready.
I love lists. As of today, I have 246 lists in my account. I use them to track the movies I watch, organize them in all sorts of different ways. I track them by hand. I clone lists from other people. I use them to plan what I'm going to be watching, all sorts of things. I love creating lists. It's a fantastic tool.
Sexiest animated characters. Andy, what is this?
We love Letterboxd, and if you're a movie lover, we are sure you will too. And when you upgrade from the free account, you will remove ads and support the great Kiwi team building this amazing service.
Just use the discount code NEXTREEL or visit thenextreel.com/letterboxd to get 20% off your pro or patron membership. And it works for renewals as well.